Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join our live demo covering Meltdown and Spectre, how to detect the vulnerabilities and exploits. I'm Nate Hines, moderator of today's session, and with me today is Sasha Dobbs, Principal Product Marketing Manager. Sasha has extensive experience in information security, so please feel free to ask questions via the webcast chat window as he goes through the presentation. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can before wrapping up today. And with that, I will turn things over to Sasha to get started.
Great, thanks Nate, and thanks to everyone for joining me today, on joining Nate and myself. So Meltdown and Spectre obviously made the news in the past few days. A lot of great questions coming in from our customers across the community, and so definitely want to share a little bit about both the type of attacks. Hopefully I'll answer some of your questions, and obviously talk a little bit about how you can use USM Anywhere, or the Alien Vault USM platform, in order to be able to detect where you have vulnerabilities and, when they happen, exploits. So what are we going to cover in this webcast? Key things, what are Meltdown and Spectre, and what are their impact? We'll cover talking about, obviously, how to protect yourself or detect vulnerabilities where you may be vulnerable, and of course using Alien Vault USM Anywhere. I'll touch upon obviously that, and get into an actual live demo of our product and show what you might expect to see within the product, and how that can apply to your particular environment. And of course, while it's a short special webinar today, we will of course hopefully get to answer some of your questions at the end, even if we run a little bit long. So please do drop them into the window, and we'll be sure to answer them towards the end of the webinar. So unless you've been hiding under a rock, or you've been on vacation, lucky you, since January the 3rd, which is when the two vulnerabilities were officially announced, there's been a lot of news hitting basically the cycles and hitting our inboxes and websites. Here's just three samples, but it shows the extent of this particular attack, which effectively affects pretty much every processor built since 1995. It leverages some of the capabilities that were designed into processors in order to try and help speed things up. So, Apple's confirmed that all iPhone, at the same time, anything, iPad, Apple devices and Apple computers are affected. Initially, it was just stated that Intel was infected, but in fact, if you have a processor from Intel, Apple, AMD, or ARM, then obviously different models across the board, then there's chances that you are infected as well. But yeah, chances are you are at risk from this type of attack. Now, of course, hearing that you're at risk, I mean, that's the thing that makes the headlines, but we'll definitely talk a little bit about how the attack how you can be exploited by such an attack, and the impact to your systems and obviously to your information and data. So just a quick timeline, way back when in 1995, that's when the first CPUs that were susceptible to either of these attacks were shipped. Obviously, in some cases, it's been understood, or there's been different types of things that have, it's been suspected that this kind of attack took place. But it was only within the past 6 months or so that basically, Google with their Project Zero, a number of universities such as and I hope I pronounce this right, the Graz University of Technology, as well as the University of Pennsylvania, University of Maryland, as well as the University of Adelaide, along with a number of private companies such as Rambus and Data61, have really been researching this, and about the same time all came to similar conclusions about how the CPU architecture and the way it actually works could be attacked, which culminated in these reports about Spectre and Meltdown, which, once these reports came out, of course, they all got together and they communicated with the major chip companies with an example of how that flaw could actually take place. And so those communications have been happening since about June 2017. Now, as with any reputable company that's going to announce things like, hey, you've got a vulnerability, a certain window of time is provided in order to be able to allow those companies to respond, whether it's through a software company with a software patch or whether it's a firmware patch. Fact is, there were actually some changes that were made into the Linux file system, which were detected by the community. And as that started to get leaked towards the end of that last year, beginning of this year, really forced the hand of the researchers to actually publish the information. And so that's one of the things, that's why a lot of patches and some of them have started to come through, but in general, we've been seeing more and more vendors out there pushing out patches, whether it's for the firmware, as I said, or the operating system vendors actually putting out patches for their particular operating systems as well. So whether you have a device like running something like Android or iOS, or whether you're actually running Windows, Linux, there are patches, again, depending on the distribution. Some are in testing, some have been released, and we'll expect to see additional patches down the road as well. So this is just a quick comparison of Meltdown and Spectre. And so a big thank you out to gentleman Daniel Miesler. You can see his link down at the bottom. But effectively, this is a great summary of the different types of CPUs that are affected by each of the attacks. In both cases, really the attacker needs to have local access to the system. So they need to compromise the user on the machine, and obviously if the user is an administrator, then there's even more access to the machine to install the malware. Now, the Google Project Zero and some of the researchers came out with some sample code, and as I said, in order for that to work, you actually need to install it on the box. Remote attack does not seem possible, or at least hasn't been discovered at this time. The two types of methods that either will attack, so Meltdown will basically try and corrupt the Intel privilege escalation, or take advantage of the Intel privilege escalation. Also speculative execution. Privilege escalation is obviously trying to get access to higher privileges on that machine so they can get access across to other applications and data. Speculative execution is actually something that has been designed in chips, and it's one of those things that's really designed to speed up performance. And what it does is, as we all know, processors don't tend to be running at 100% all the time. So they said basically, okay, how can we take advantage of the power of the CPU? One of the things we can do to speed it up is that the processor will run some executions, whether they're actually needed or not. And so if the chance that it runs some calculation that then tends to be needed within, is found to be needed within the next few seconds or few minutes, then it's there and it's immediately available. The processing has been done. That's speculative execution. Now the attackers found out a way that they can actually use that technology to grab data because sometimes it may be put in an area of memory, and so with some mathematical calculations, you can be a pretty good guess as to where in memory that data may be. And so some of the examples that the researchers showed where they could actually detect where speculative execution was going to put those data bits and ultimately leak them out to a third party. Spectre, slightly different. It also looks at speculative execution. It also takes advantage of something called branch prediction. This is another way that the manufacturers have tried to speed up performance. And then if you think about anyone who's done any development, if then or else statement as one example, again, the computer is trying to guess what's going to happen next. And so a lot of the time the branch prediction, the speculative execution will work hand in hand, but ultimately both were designed to speed things up. But through both of these attacks, you can read data, or you can potentially have the computer execute code that was not intended to be executed. So with Meltdown, it will basically read kernel memory from the user space. With Spectre, it has the ability not just to read it from the user space, but basically look at data across all applications that are running on that same processor inside that processor's memory. And so, the problem with things like Spectre, it can affect not just your home PC, but potentially it has the ability to attack, especially multi-user environments. If you think about a lot of hosting environments, if you think about the public cloud like AWS and Azure, the potential is that if you have multiple people running on the same machine, very common in virtualization and public cloud environments, then if you can attack the processor and start to get information and leak information out that all the different users and applications are accessing on that processor and its memory, that's where Spectre really comes into play. Now, of course, a lot of the leading public cloud vendors have gone ahead and patched their systems and are continuing to monitor the situation, but it's always wise to check with whatever service provider you have as to what mitigation strategies they've put in. So the remediation today, frankly, it's software patches. Meltdown, pretty straightforward. Spectre, Not quite so straightforward. There's a little more nuance in there. The goal of this webinar today is not really to go into the how the attack works in any greater detail, or the specific application of the software patches, other than identifying how you can identify where you're vulnerable, where patches exist that you should go off and deploy, as well as different ways that you can actually detect should something be compromised. So what has Alien Vault Labs seen? So for those of you who don't know, Alien Vault has a dedicated lab security team. That's all they do. They sit out there, they watch what's going on, they look at different attacks, they use a bunch of honeypots, machine learning, as well as human intelligence, just really understanding what's going on across the ecosystem and across the internet. And frankly, today, nobody is aware of any attacks that have leveraged these particular vulnerabilities. At the same time, they can be difficult to detect. There are some things that we definitely do within the Alien Vault USM products that will identify various natures of attack, using indicators of compromise, and I'll cover those in just a few moments. That said, we have seen samples of malware trying to exploit the vulnerabilities that were published. And as it says here, most of those right now are variants of the samples provided by the disclosing teams. So frankly, it's early days. And so, similar to what we saw with WannaCry and also Petya, the understanding of how the attack works is now out there. Patches are coming out in order to be able to prevent those kind of attacks, or at least mitigate the risk from those attacks. But ultimately, it's up to you to understand where you're vulnerable and to put the appropriate mitigation strategies in place. And that's ultimately where a company and our products like Alien Vault USM can really help. And so for those that are interested, on the right-hand side are just some of the samples. In fact, if you go to our Open Threat Exchange, the URL is at the bottom, otx.alienvault.com. It's a free threat intelligence platform. All you need is an email to sign up. You can actually search on Spectre and Meltdown and start to get information about what type of attacks are starting to emerge in the wild. And our community of over 65,000 participants of that open source, crowdsourced threat intelligence, as soon as any attacks start to pop up, that's where they're going to post this kind of information. And that's exactly what happened with early attacks like WannaCry and the Petya variant, and other attacks as well, is that the community had that information very quickly, and it was being fed into Alien Vault USM customers so they could leverage it as quickly as possible, and anyone else leveraging the Open Threat Exchange at the same time. So I know the question that many of you are wondering is, are software patches available? Frankly, yes. There are early software patches, and I emphasize the word early. We have seen basically patches being pushed out by Apple, by Microsoft for their Surface and Service Book, by Android. There's obviously patches for different operating system variants, Windows. I put various Linux distributions. There's ones out for CentOS, Red Hat, Fedora, and Ubuntu. Debian, they have one currently in test. In fact, there's a good site on GitHub that shows all the latest statuses on patches if you want to investigate that yourself. Again, that's an area where something like Alien Vault can really help to identify not just where the vulnerabilities are, but are there available patches to deploy. That said, with many of these patches, some have been seen to actually slow down the processor. Remember the two ways that are being taken advantage of, the branch prediction, the speculative execution, are all designed to speed up the performance of the processor. And so many of these patches are basically muting that performance capability and ultimately slowing down the processor, sometimes by as much as 40%. There's also been evidence of patches that have crashed the system, especially in the Microsoft ecosystem. There were some challenges with some antivirus vendors, where applying the patches the way that they were applied would actually end up with the dreaded blue screen of death. And so, again, patches are available, but as always, one should be cautious in terms of applying those patches. Test before you do it across a large array of machines. Make sure you have a good backup plan, regardless of any of these types of attack, whether it's Meltdown or Spectre or any other type of attack. You should always test patches before you deploy, and having a backup strategy is always good, because you never know what kind of attack is going to take place, whether it be something like ransomware or something else that's going to disrupt your network. So ultimately, how do you decrease your risk from Meltdown and Spectre? So again, I'm just re-emphasizing the points that I just raised. Evaluate and fully test all the available patches for your different systems. Ultimately, it's up to you whether you actually deploy them. Determine if it's, for all your different systems, are they at risk for someone being able to get direct access onto the system and actually run some exploit code? If you feel that the risk is not quite as high, then obviously you can make the decision to hold off, maybe wait till some more optimal patches, maybe some that actually don't decrease performance quite as dramatically. Again, test out, see what works for your environment, and ultimately make sure that it meets your risk requirements or your threshold of risk that you're willing to accommodate. Apply the same protections for any malware or ransomware. Frankly, whether it's Meltdown, Spectre, or something that we don't know about tomorrow, the same best practices to put in place still exist. So evaluate the need for things like services that are running on your machines. Again, things like WannaCry took advantage of the SMB-v1 service. And there are other applications and services that be running on your different machines. Again, are they all necessary? Are there some you can block? Are there some that you need to only ensure are communicating internally and not to everything external? And what things are you going to put in place to detect that? Architect your environment to do things like network segmentation, because if there is something like a worm that comes in or some sort of virus, it's a case, how do you stop them from self-propagating? At some point, I fully expect that there's going to be some attack, again, like previous ones that we've seen, that take advantage of these vulnerabilities and somehow find a way to propagate themselves across different machines. So again, segmentation is a great way, as well as the least privilege model. Make sure that people don't have full keys to the kingdom and that accounts are running in that least privilege mode. Training your organization, again, this is a default thing. Make sure people know how to watch out for attacks that could get malware into the environment. And at the same time, if they do suspect they've been compromised, how do they report that back to you? And last but not least, implement a backup plan, and then also have offline backups, and also have a series over time of offline backups, because ultimately, again, you never know what's going to happen. You never know when, if, or how these exploits or other exploits are going to take advantage of your system. And so being able to get that data back is critical. And then ultimately, deploying a solution like Alien Vault USM Anywhere, which is really designed to provide security essentials that help with all the above, with the exception of backup. It's all about detecting risks in your environment, like vulnerabilities, as well as identifying when attacks are actually taking place, or whether anomalies or indicators of compromise are suggesting that attack is taking place. And of course, Alien Vault USM Anywhere allows you to do that, not just on premises, but also on your cloud environments and applications, and in a hybrid manner as well. So just to talk about what we offer within Alien Vault USM, it's effectively a unified platform providing a unified approach to threat detection and response. And so, understanding what assets are out in your environment. So especially if someone is deploying, let's say they brought in a machine from home because they were trying to run something within the office, maybe it's their own personal machine that they haven't patched, and they plug it into your network. Asset discovery will identify the fact that it's attached in. Or if someone's spinning up new virtual machines inside a hosted or Amazon, etc. Vulnerability assessment, obviously detecting what's going on in your environment, what vulnerabilities are out there. Like this, detecting the vulnerabilities and available patches like we just talked about. Intrusion detection, at some point, an attack will try to take advantage of this exploit. We've already seen it in the wild that people are leveraging that sample code. And so we already have intrusion detection signatures within Alien Vault USM to be able to pick those up. Behavioral monitoring, all about suspicious activities by users and administrators. And last but not least, SIEM and log management, being able to correlate, analyze, and report on security event data from across all your environments, pulling in all those events centrally so you can both store them for things like compliance, do forensics investigations. At the same time, you can do correlation actively to identify other threats. Key thing here, threat intelligence. Optimizing threat detection response. Your products are only as good as the information within them. So already within Alien Vault USM Anywhere, we have vulnerability signatures to scan for, we have intrusion detection capabilities, and we have response capabilities. And all this is provided by threat intelligence provided by the Alien Vault lab security research team, as well as through the Open Threat Exchange. And so, again, it's providing that information on a continual basis, and it's immediately available into the product so you can detect those vulnerabilities and be able to respond accordingly. Finally, we have the ability through Alien Apps to not just gather data, but also do responses to actually, if you do detect a malware on a particular device, you can isolate it, for example, using something like Carbon Black, or you could actually disable the networking using our own forensics response app. So enough talking, let's get into a quick demo of the product. If you bear with me, I will just change my screen. Okay, so what we have here is Alien Vault USM Anywhere. And so this is the overview dashboard. It's the first thing that you see when you log into the product. And I talked about the security essentials. This is where you get a quick summary picture of everything happening within your network. As we scroll down, we can see what alarms are being generated. We can see what are the different methods or the top methods that are generating alarms across the environment. So, in this case, I've got some credentials stolen. I've got a lot of log-on failures. And again, if there are patterns there or a lot of activity, so if I'm a small organization and suddenly I see 100 users created, that could be indicative of something wrong going on. I can see what data sources I'm gathering events from. So I mentioned that I can gather from on-premises up into the cloud. I can see where they're coming from, and I can also see the trends that are going on. So if I see a huge dip or a huge spike, that could be, again, an anomaly or an indicator of that something wrong is going on. And I get that information across the different sensors that I have deployed. As I go down, what assets are deployed, what operating systems, what services, and what software are running on each. Again, just understanding what is out there on my environment, and that is being detected day by day. And last but not least, once we know the assets, we can do discovery on those assets to understand which of my assets are vulnerable and where do I need to prioritize my time, high, medium, or low severity. So obviously, I want to focus on the high ones. And all the way back to the top, alarms by intent. So when things like intrusions are detected, then we basically we create an alarm and categorize it across 5 levels of risk. It's what's called a kill chain taxonomy. Environmental awareness could be someone logging into Dropbox, all the way to system compromise, which is where malware has been detected. As an example, malware has been detected on a device. Now, the first thing we're going to think about when we do detecting for Spectre and Meltdown, let's take a look at what vulnerabilities we have across in our network. So I'm just going to mention one of the capabilities that do vulnerability scanning. In fact, I've already got a filter out here where I'm actually searching for the CVEs that are associated with, or at least the first 3 CVEs. Now, over time, you can customize this. There will be other CVEs being published for different operating systems. In fact, some of that information is already being brought in here. So I've got a number of Red Hat. I've got some CentOS information. So I've already discovered which of my systems are vulnerable to this exploit because I have not installed the necessary patches. And I can click into that. And again, immediately, because threat intelligence has put this in the product for me already, and it's part of the service, I've got that information. I can see what the reference ID, I can actually read the description. And at the bottom, if there's any available patches, it will actually identify that for you. And again, it's all about reducing your effort and your time, allowing you to prioritize and focus on the problem, rather than have to actually go off and investigate and go to system by system or just treat it as part of your general patch policy. So once I've identified what's going on, I can then go off and, I could, in this case, create a ticket with ServiceNow or Jira and actually, work with my patching team or my desktop management or server management team and actually instruct them that, hey, this server or these servers are in need of update. Please go ahead and patch them. So that covers some of the vulnerability management. And as I said, as soon as new vulnerabilities are discovered, whether it's today, tomorrow, or in a month or 2 months' time, through the threat intelligence service, that information will be there ready to go. Now, if we go back into our dashboards, let's say, for example, there is an attack that took place, and I can pop into, in this, I'm going to see what attacks are going on. And, in most cases, or in many cases, it will be, we can detect when data is going off to a known malicious IP address or a command and control server, for example, like this one right here. So if I click into here, I can get information about, okay, in this case, what malware it is, We do have detections that are based on the samples, but as these new attacks come to the fore, again, all these correlation directors and ability to detect these attacks are fed from our threat intelligence service. So within hours, if not shorter, of an attack surfacing, we will have the ability for you to actually detect that attack taking place inside your environment. So if there's a variant, let's say find pause, that takes advantage of Spectre or Meltdown, it will pop up. It will identify the traffic going across the network, going to a known malicious IP, and you can see both the source and the destination will enhance and enrich the context accordingly. Some description about what is going on, and some quick recommendations about what to do. So in this case, I'm going to isolate this particular system off the network. I'm going to use my carbon black solution, and I can say, okay, isolate the source. I could use my alien app for Palo Alto or Cisco Umbrella just to block the IP and just to block the communication as well. But because I believe and I want to do some quick response, I'm going to go ahead and isolate that system right off the network. You see I did it straight away manually there. If I want to, I can create a rule for similar alarms. Again, I can tailor that rule so that should USM Anywhere detect those situations coming up in the future, it can go ahead and automatically initiate that action for me. One of the other things I can do, especially with our internal forensics app, there are a number of actions that I can actually run against different Windows machines. So you'll see a whole series of actions, basic forensics info. One of the great things that we've put into the mix is we've actually, anyone's aware of Microsoft put out a PowerShell script so you can actually query Windows machines to understand if they're vulnerable. And so we've encapsulated that into, not that one, into a PowerShell script. So we just need to put get speculation, if I can type correctly, control settings. So this is one that we've created that's immediately available. Again, it's fed through our threat intelligence service. You can use it through our forensics response app. I can select any Windows machine out across my environment. I'm going to choose a terminal server and run that particular task against that box. And what's going to happen now is it's going to actually install that script, run it, do its necessary investigation, report that back into USM Anywhere, and I can go back and understand, based upon that script, is that particular machine compromised? So it's just another way to dig down deep, another way of detecting, at-risk machines. You may want to just run that specifically against your mission critical ones, for example. Prioritize your focus and get that information out. So just another way that we're simplifying things for you to do, rather than, again, getting that huge long script and trying to run it across different machines. So that's just a quick snapshot of the ability to detect the vulnerabilities, detect intrusions that may be taking place, as well as some simplification of how to run PowerShell scripts using our internal forensics app. And as I said, forensics app, you can do other things such as forensics queries, running basic up to advanced, doing things like disabling the network adapter, which has the same effect as isolating that machine off the network. So this is just a few of the ways that we can actually touch upon and actually help protect you and your environment with USM Anywhere against Meltdown and against Spectre in your environment. So just going to switch back to the presentation. Okay, I went through this slide earlier on, but Nate, I know you've got a quick questionnaire for our audience.
Yes, thank you, Sasha. So now that we've seen a bit of the platform, we actually want to launch a quick poll to see if anyone would be interested in scheduling a personalized demo of USM Anywhere. So we'll go ahead and launch that now. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay.
All right, Sasha, are we ready to jump into Q&A?
I think so. I'm just going to bring up the Q&A slide. Yeah, definitely, if you're interested, you can test drive USM Anywhere for free. You can try it in our sandbox environment, or actually, if you're further interested, you can get pricing and a quote. The links are available on the screen there. Let's get to some questions.
Excellent. First question, are you going to specifically address how to detect these vulnerabilities?
No. So there's definitely a lot of research out there that goes through the mechanism to detect vulnerabilities, but obviously all the different chip manufacturers and operating system vendors are out there doing their best to provide patches And over time, they'll obviously optimize those patches as well to ensure that you're getting the most out of your CPU. What we at Alien Vault do, we work to detect when those vulnerabilities are discovered. We actually will work to detect where those vulnerabilities exist based upon that information, as well as help indicate what patches are available to actually go ahead and patch or fix or mitigate the risk on those vulnerable systems. But yeah, I'm not going to actually cover any deeper than what we've had time to do today. That'd probably be a TED talk in itself. So, but thanks for the question.
Great. Are there vulnerability signatures already in USM to detect Meltdown Spectre-specific vulnerabilities?
Yes, there are. So literally, as soon as the vulnerabilities hit the open, in some cases before they hit the open, we have great relationships with many vendors. That's our job is protecting our customers and the community. Then we put those vulnerability signatures into our threat intelligence. At the same time, the same thing goes for correlation directives or threat detection capabilities. It's all about the threat intelligence, and we make sure that that's one of the big values of Alien Vault USM is the fact that we have that integrated threat intelligence that's part of the platform, whether you're getting it from Alien Vault directly in our threat labs or hook directly into OTX as well and get it from the community. So as I said, that's ultimately, but definitely there's quite a few vulnerability detectors based upon all the different patches that have been coming out from Microsoft for Windows, from Apple, from the different Linux distributions, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. Thanks, Sasha. Have there been any examples of Spectre and Meltdown malware in the wild yet?
Well, I kind of touched upon this very briefly. Not that we're aware of. So, obviously, these are challenging attacks to detect. But at the same time, as I was talking about the indicators of compromise earlier on, those can be indicative, or, they don't necessarily identify what the specific threat is. It could be a known malicious IP address or infrastructure that's popped up, and that's where both, again, threat intelligence, the community really comes into play. Is that they do tend to find these malicious sites and areas, infrastructure very quickly, and start to put that information either into OTX or whether Alien Vault puts it through the threat intelligence from the labs team. And it's all about being able to detect not just an actual signature of a threat, but activities that could comprise an anomaly, whether it's actually something going through the network, whether it's some sort of user activity or behavior, maybe privilege escalation. These are all kind of things that Alien Vault USM is continuously looking for to identify if there is a threat to your environment. And so specifically for Meltdown and for Spectre, the intrusion detection capabilities are based upon the sample code that was put out, but we will continue to monitor the whole threat ecosystem to identify if there are attacks that start to leverage these capabilities. As I mentioned earlier on, there are definitely some trials out there trying to leverage that code that was put out as a sample, but beyond that kind of trial and experimentation, which again we're detecting and picking up, we haven't seen anything more severe at this time.
Okay. Let's see, a couple more questions here, then we'll wrap up. How can you detect Spectre and Meltdown for customers that have the USM on-premise appliance instead of USM Anywhere?
Good question. So again, it all comes down to the threat intelligence. So there are vulnerability information already being fed through the Alien Vault threat intelligence feeds, so that whether you're using whichever the Alien Vault USM platforms you're using, we're providing the most up-to-date information in order to detect not just vulnerabilities, but again, as and when those exploits are taken advantage of by some attack, that information will be in there as well. And so, if you as long as you have you've kept your threat intelligence up to date, and again, hooking into the Open Threat Exchange, which of course is free for anybody, you will get those indicators coming through at the same time. So that's how we're addressing that. Again, can't overemphasize that. This really does highlight the importance not just of the capability of the platform, but also that latest threat intelligence so you can detect those vulnerabilities and any current or future attacks as they take place.
Okay, thanks, Sasha. And last question here. Are there any patches that could be applied immediately for Windows or Linux operating systems that have been shown to not affect performance, or is waiting on all patches recommended?
You know what? That's always a fun question. It's like, how good is good enough? And I think that purely comes back to, is it good enough for you? Definitely test it out. I mean, that's the key thing. You don't want to suddenly deploy something that you suddenly find is messing up your performance to an extent that you're breaking your business. So test it and just validate that it is meeting your own requirements. I think that, different performance hits have been seen across the board. So while one machine, you could take the same patch and apply it to machine A and have a severe performance impact. You could apply it to machine B and have lesser of a performance impact until you actually deploy it and test it in your environment or in ideally a staging environment. You're not going to know the true extent or impact of that patch. Over time, for sure, we're going to see improvements and optimizations. The goal right now is for the patches that are available are to address the risk, and then over time they will look to make it better and better with better performance and maybe some other enhancements that again keep the system secure.
All right. Well, thank you, Sasha. We are about ready to wrap up, but before we do, as always, we have selected one winner out of today's attendees to receive a $100 Amazon gift card. So congratulations to Jeremy Bannister. You are today's winner, and we'll be in touch after the webinar to get you squared away with your gift card. So it looks like that's about all the time we have, but before we go, I'd like to point out we have a free 14-day trial of USM Anywhere that you can start today and test drive in your environment. And if we weren't able to get to your questions today, we will have someone follow up with you. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at hello@alienvault.com or on Twitter @alienvault. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you to Sasha, and hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everybody.